Since no axe, spear, or blade could touch my son today, he will now be known as Bjørn Ironside.
In an age of steel and slaughter, one man was whispered to be untouchable. Legends claim that no blade could bite his skin, no arrow could pierce his heart. They called him Ironside. But was it magic, superior armor, or a tactical brilliance that bordered on the supernatural? Today, we strip away the myth to find the man who led the most ambitious Viking voyage in history. Björn. Björn Ironside. Scandinavia in the early 9th century was a world carved from granite and ice. A world where the gods were not distant abstractions. They breathed in the storm. They bled in the sunset. The Norse people did not merely survive this brutal landscape. They thrived. They built. They dreamed. And those dreams had sails. The longship, that masterpiece of Viking engineering, was not merely a vessel, it was a statement, a declaration sent to every coastline within reach. We are coming, and there is nothing you can do. To understand Björn Ironside, you must first understand the shadow he was born into. His father, Ragnar Lothbrok, was not simply a powerful chieftain. Ragnar was a myth that breathed. A man so formidable that the boundary between history and legend dissolved completely around him. The sagas describe Ragnar as the scourge of the Franks, the dread of Paris, a man who reportedly raided the heart of the Carolingian Empire and walked away laughing. His sons were born already carrying a debt to destiny. Björn, most of all. Björn's birth date is lost to the fog of history. Scholars place it somewhere between 820 and 835 AD. His mother, according to some sagas, was Aslaug, a woman of extraordinary will and prophetic power in her own right. A queen who taught her sons that blood was not only what you bled, but what you claimed. From his earliest years, Björn was shaped by a world that had no patience for softness. Norse children of the aristocracy were trained in combat before they were teenagers. They were taught that Valhalla was not a threat, it was a promise. The highest honor was to die with a sword in your hand. But there was something different about this boy. Something in the set of his jaw, the steadiness of his gaze. His half-brothers were fierce. His brothers were dangerous. Björn was iron. He hadn't drawn his first sword in battle, and already the world was not ready for him. Every legend has a first raid, a first kill, a first moment when the boy becomes something the world will never forget. The first recorded raids attributed to Björn Ironside place him in the Baltic region, striking coastal settlements with the precision and ferocity that would become his hallmark. He was, by all accounts, terrifyingly effective. Viking raids were not mindless pillaging, though they were certainly terrifying. They were exercises in logistics, intelligence, and overwhelming force delivered with surgical speed. You had to know the tides, you had to know the rivers, you had to be gone before anyone could respond. By the 840s, Björn's name began appearing in Frankish chronicles, and never in good news. The monks who kept these records wrote with shaking hands about longships materializing from the morning fog, about screams that preceded the smoke. They had no word for what was happening to them, only fear. Björn struck the Seine Valley, he struck the Loire, He raided deep into territory that Frankish kings considered the heart of their civilization, and he did it with apparent ease. Again, and again, and again. The Carolingian Empire, once the greatest power in Europe, built by the legendary Charlemagne, was crumbling from within. And Bjørn Ironside was one of the men holding the torch to its edges. At some point, in some battle whose exact date no chronicle preserved, Bjørn earned the name that history would carry forward: Ironside. Jornsida in Old Norse. The sagas offer different explanations. Some say he wore an extraordinary byrnie of chainmail that no blade could pierce. Others suggest it was his bearing in combat, an almost supernatural calmness while arrows found everyone around him and left him untouched. He had a name now, an identity forged in fire and blood. The question was, how far could Ironside go? To rule the seas, you didn't just need courage, you needed allies. And for Bjørn, his most powerful allies shared his blood. Ragnar Lothbrok's sons were individually fearsome. Together, they were a catastrophe that the entire Western world struggled to contain. History has never seen a brotherhood quite like them, and history has tried. Ivar the Boneless, the cold, brilliant strategist, the mind behind campaigns that broke kingdoms. Halfdan Ragnarsson, the warrior of the north, relentless as the Arctic winter. Sigurd Snake in the Eye, Ubbe Ragnarsson, and Bjørn, the one who looked south, across the known world, and decided that the Mediterranean itself was not beyond reach. It was around this period that Bjørn formed one of history's great military partnerships. Hastein, also known as Hasting, was a Viking warlord of extraordinary capability. Sharp, adaptable, endlessly inventive. Where Bjørn was iron, Hastein was fire. Together, they began planning something unprecedented, something that even among Vikings, a people who had already shocked the world, would be spoken of in whispers of disbelief. They would take their fleet beyond the familiar shores of Francia and Britain. They would sail into the Mediterranean Sea, and they would not stop. Think about what they were proposing. To take longships, designed for rivers and coastal raids, through the Strait of Gibraltar, into a sea they had never sailed, surrounded by the remnants of the greatest empires in human history. The Moorish Caliphate, the Frankish Kingdom, the city-states of Italy, and even the long shadow of the Eastern Roman Empire. This was not a raid. This was an invasion of the entire known world. They had a dream that entire armies had never dared. Now they had to survive long enough to chase it. Before Bjørn could conquer the world took something from him. Something that would change everything. The exact date remains debated. But sometime in the 860s, Ragnar Lothbrok, the most legendary Viking of his age, made a catastrophic decision. He would invade Northumbria, alone, with only 2 ships. Was it arrogance? Was it fate? Was it a man who had lived so long in legend that he had begun to believe he truly was untouchable? We cannot know. What we know is the outcome. King Aelle of Northumbria captured Ragnar, and in an act of brutality that would echo through centuries, he executed the great Viking chieftain by throwing him into a pit of serpents. Ragnar died surrounded by snakes. The news reached Björn and his brothers like a blade to the chest. And that grief, raw Viking grief, did not become tears. It became an army, the largest Viking force ever assembled. They called it the Great Heathen Army, and history has validated the name. This was not a raid. This was retribution on a continental scale. England would burn, and Northumbria would learn what it cost to kill a Ragnarsson's father. Ivar the Boneless commanded the strategy. Halfdan provided the northern fury. But Björn brought something else entirely. He brought the cold, focused energy of a man who had decided that the world would know his father's name by knowing what happened to those who ended it. King Aelle of Northumbria was captured. And then came the sentence that has haunted historians and horrified readers for over 1,000 years. The Blood Eagle. A ritual execution so brutal that scholars still debate whether it was practice or poetry, whether it was real or metaphor. What is beyond debate is this: Aelle died, Northumbria fell, and the sons of Ragnar had announced to the world that there was a price, an absolute, irrevocable price, for touching their bloodline. The father was avenged. But vengeance, once tasted, reshapes the man who drinks it, and Björn was just getting started. No Viking had ever done what Björn was about to do. He was about to sail into the center of the ancient world and shake it to its foundation. In 859 AD, Bjørn Ironside and Halfdan assembled a fleet of approximately 62 longships, some sources say more, and sailed south from the Loire estuary. Their destination was the edge of the known world, and then beyond. Think of the men aboard those ships, warriors who had raided Britain and Francia and the Baltic coast, men who had seen battle in a dozen countries, and yet, as they approached the coast of Iberia, even they must have felt the weight of what they were attempting. They were sailing into legend. The Iberian coast, controlled largely by the sophisticated and militarily formidable Emirate of Córdoba, was the first real test. The Moors were not the frightened monks of Irish monasteries. They had cavalry, fortifications, naval forces, and Greek fire. And yet Björn and Halfdan struck successfully at Algeciras, the very gateway to the Mediterranean, looting its mosque and taking plunder that would have made any Frankish king envious. It was an almost impossible achievement, and they had barely begun. From Iberia, the fleet turned south. They struck the North African coast, Nakur in modern-day Morocco. They enslaved members of the local nobility, looted, burned, and in doing so, became perhaps the only Viking force in history to raid the African continent. Full stop. These were men from the cold northern darkness of Scandinavia, raiding a land of heat and ancient desert empires. The cultural, geographic, and military distance they had traveled, in every sense, was staggering, even by Viking standards. And then they turned east. Into the western Mediterranean, into the sea that Julius Caesar had sailed, into the waters where the Phoenicians built their empire, into the birthplace of Western civilization. And they came, not as scholars, not as merchants, but as conquerors. Julius Caesar crossed the Rubicon. Bjørn Ironside crossed something far more ancient and far more symbolic. What if the most famous city in the world was not what you thought it was? And what if you could fool an entire civilization into opening its gates? The fleet swept through the Gulf of Lion. They raided the Provençal coast with ease. They wintered on an island at the mouth of the Rhône. And then, in what must have been a moment of almost unimaginable ambition, Hasstein proposed a target that made even battle-hardened warriors pause. Rome. Rome, the eternal city, the seat of the Pope, the spiritual heart of Christendom, and the echo of the greatest empire the world had ever known. Hasstein wanted to sack Rome, to take from the center of civilization what civilization had always taken from others. They found what they believed was Rome, a magnificent city on the Italian coast, gleaming walls, great towers, a city worthy of legend. The city was called Luna. It was not Rome. It was, in fact, more than 300 miles from Rome. But the Vikings did not know that. Luna was a significant Roman-era settlement in modern Liguria, northern Italy, and to Norsemen who had never seen the Mediterranean world up close, it could absolutely have seemed like the grandest city in existence. The mistake was honest. The solution they devised was anything but. The walls of Luna were too strong. We're bound for another word. From me of the walls of salt would cost too many lives. So Hasstein, the trickster, the fox among wolves, devised a plan so audacious that it has echoed through the centuries as one of history's great deceptions. He would pretend to be dying. Emissaries were sent to the city. Hasstein, they said, was gravely ill. A great Viking warrior lay at death's door. His dying wish? To receive Christian baptism, to die in peace, absolved of his sins before God. A noble end for a noble enemy. The Bishop of Luna, moved by what appeared to be genuine repentance, agreed. The ceremony was performed. Hasstein was baptized. And then, he died. Or appeared to. A funeral procession was requested to bring the great Viking's body into the city for Christian burial. The gates of Luna opened. The funeral bier entered, and Hasstein, very much alive, exploded from the coffin with a sword in his hand as Viking warriors flooded through the open gates behind him. Luna fell before its citizens understood what had happened. When Hasstein discovered it was not Rome, the sagas say he wept with rage and frustration. And then he burned Luna anyway. Because Bjørn Ironside and Hasstein had not sailed this far to go home empty-handed. They had tricked an entire city into opening its gates, sailed to Africa, raided Spain, France, and Italy, and they were still going. Getting in was one thing. Getting out, with the whole Mediterranean wanting your blood, was something else entirely. The the return journey was not the triumphant homecoming the sagas might imply. As Bjorn's fleet attempted to pass back through the Strait of Gibraltar, the Moorish forces of the Emirate of Cordoba were waiting. They had learned from the outward journey. They had prepared. The engagement was catastrophic for the Norse fleet. Ships were captured, ships were burned, men were taken prisoner, and those prisoners were sent to Constantinople as proof of the caliphate's power. Of the 62 ships that had departed, only a fraction survived. In 862 AD, the surviving ships of Bjorn's fleet returned to the Loire. They had been gone for roughly 3 years. 3 years of continuous raiding, fighting, sailing, surviving. They brought back gold, silk, silver, enslaved nobility, and proof of places most Europeans only knew from ancient texts. The Norse world received them not as survivors, but as gods. Men who had sailed to the edge of existence and returned. Bjørn Ironside had led the greatest Viking expedition in recorded history. And he was only halfway through his story. He had conquered the Mediterranean. Now he had to build something that would outlast him. What does a man who has seen the whole world do when he finally comes home? Bjørn Ironside's later years are less dramatic than his great Mediterranean campaign, but they are perhaps more historically significant. Because what Bjørn built at home was, in many ways, just as audacious as anything he'd achieved abroad. Historical sources, including the Ynglinga saga, suggest that Bjørn settled in Sweden, specifically in the region around Uppsala, the spiritual and political heart of the Norse world. He became a king, not through conquest, through legitimacy, through the weight of a name earned across a lifetime of extraordinary deeds. To be a Viking king was not to wear a crown and sit in comfort. It was to be the center of a constantly shifting web of alliances, threats, tribute, and loyalty. You maintained power by being useful, or by being frightening. Bjørn had spent a lifetime mastering both. His sons, Refil and Erik, would continue his line. The Munsö dynasty, which scholars connect to Bjørn's descendants, shaped the Swedish royal house for generations. Bjørn Ironside was not just a warrior king. He was a founder, a root from which nations would grow. Even in his later years, Bjørn could not fully set down the sword. There are accounts of continued raids, not the world-spanning expeditions of his prime, but the raids of a man who understood that power in the Viking world must be continuously demonstrated. A king who stopped raiding was a king who was fading. Bjørn Ironside never faded. Even the reports of his final years describe a man who commanded absolute respect, a man around whom younger warriors gathered like iron filings around a lodestone. Age had not diminished him. It had tempered him. The raids slowed. The kingdom grew. But the iron in the man, that never cooled. Every sword, no matter how strong, must eventually be laid down. The question is, how it was held. The exact date of Bjørn Ironside's death is, like so much of his life, obscured by the gap between history and saga. Scholars generally place it somewhere in the 880s, possibly as late as 900 AD. He had lived a life of extraordinary duration for a Viking warrior of his era. consider what those years contained. The raids of the 840s, the Mediterranean expedition of 859 to 862, the great battles of England, decades of command, a kingdom built, sons raised, a name made permanent. Bjorn Ironside packed more living into a single human life than most civilizations manage in centuries. Bjorn Ironside was buried on Munsö, an island in Lake Mälaren in Sweden. His burial mound still stands. You can visit it today. A great hump of earth rising from the Swedish landscape, covered in grass, and 1,000 years of silence. Under it lies a man who once held Rome's shadow in his hands. The Norse burial rite was not merely ceremony. It was theology. The boat, the weapons, the grave goods, provisions for the journey. Bjorn Ironside had already made the greatest journey in Viking history. Whatever lay beyond death, the Norse believed he would approach it the same way he'd approached everything else in this world, with iron. Here, a word of honesty is required. Much of what we know about Bjorn Ironside comes from sources written long after his death. Sagas composed in Iceland centuries later, Frankish chronicles with their own political agendas, Arab accounts equally prone to embellishment. Does that diminish him? Scholars disagree. Some argue the historical Bjorn was far less spectacular than the legendary one. Others point to the sheer number of independent sources confirming the core elements of his story, the Mediterranean raids chief among them, and suggest that where there is this much smoke, there was absolutely a magnificent fire. History and legend have been fighting over Bjorn Ironside for 1,100 years. That in itself tells you something. A man dies. A legend doesn't. But what exactly did Bjorn Ironside leave for the world that came after him? Bjorn's descendants continued his dynasty in Sweden. His son, Erik Björnsson, is mentioned in the Ynglinga saga, and the line of the Munsö dynasty is connected to later Swedish kings. In a very real sense, the blood of Ironside runs through the veins of Scandinavian royal history. But the legacy was not merely genetic. Bjorn Ironside demonstrated something that changed the Viking world's strategic imagination forever. He proved that the Mediterranean was not an impossible dream, that Viking ships, given bold enough captains, could go anywhere, do anything, take anything. Consider the ripples from Bjorn's Mediterranean campaign. The routes he pioneered were used by later Norse adventurers, the Normans of Sicily, the Varangian Guard of Constantinople, the Viking traders who reached Baghdad. The Viking world's expansion south and east into the very heart of the Byzantine Empire owes something to the man who first proved it could be done. The Norman kings of Sicily, descendants of those same Norse adventurers, would eventually rule one of the most sophisticated kingdoms in medieval Europe. A straight line, if a long one, can be drawn from Bjorn Ironside's longships in the Mediterranean to the coronation of Roger II of Sicily 3 centuries later. Today, Bjorn Ironside is perhaps better known to general audiences through popular culture than through history books. Television series, novels, video games, the name Ironside carries an unmistakable weight of heroic ferocity that needs no introduction. That is itself a form of immortality. But the real Bjorn, or as close to real as we can get, is, if anything, more impressive than the fictional version. Because he did it without special effects, without a script, without knowing how the story ended. He sailed into the unknown with 62 ships and sheer, unbreakable will. That's not drama, that's history. 11 centuries later, we're still telling his story. That's not luck, that's iron. In the end, every great life asks the same question of the world it leaves behind. Will you remember? On an island in Lake Mälaren, in the Swedish province of Uppland, there is a mound of earth that asks nothing of you except a moment of attention. It has been there for over 1,000 years. It will most likely be there 1,000 years from now. Stand there in the right light, at dusk when the lake turns to hammered gold. And it is not difficult to believe in the man who lies beneath. A man who saw the Mediterranean and thought, I can take that. A man who lost friends and kept sailing. A man who was iron when iron was the only language the world respected. What does it cost to be Bjørn Ironside? It costs the men who followed you and didn't come back. It costs the nights you don't sleep because the weight of command never truly lifts. It costs a childhood replaced by training and a youth spent at the edge of death. It costs, ultimately, everything. And yet, there is something in the human spirit that looks at Bjørn Ironside's life and feels not pity, but envy. Because he lived fully, completely, without reservation or retreat. He stood at the Pillars of Hercules and kept going. He faced the Blood Eagle world and refused to flinch. He was iron, and iron endures. Bjørn Ironside, son of Ragnar, brother of conquerors, raider of 3 continents, king of Uppsala, father of dynasties. A man the Mediterranean will never forget, because it has never entirely recovered from the day his sails appeared on its horizon. He was born into a world of iron. He made that world larger. And when he finally laid down his sword, the world was, by every measure, smaller for his absence.